In the remote wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, a seasoned hiker stumbled upon a strange, ancient symbol carved into a moss-covered boulder. Ethan Cole was about to realize that some discoveries should remain buried. A simple backcountry trek turned into a nightmare when an unseen presence began watching and whispering his name. Ethan Cole wasn't your typical weekend hiker. For 20 years, he had been a wilderness guide, leading expeditions through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country. Known for his sharp instincts and unshakable nerve, he had survived blizzards, flash floods, and encounters with predators. But none of that prepared him for what he found in those woods. When his fingertips brushed the symbol, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the warning text from an unknown number. "Leave now, before it sees you." Ethan ignored it, unknowingly stepping deeper into something ancient and waiting. The moment he dismissed the warning, he had already lost. What began as a solo hiking trip would become a desperate fight for survival against an entity that defied reality itself. The wilderness would never be the same after Ethan Cole uncovered the seal that should have never been broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of Ethan Cole's boots crunching through damp undergrowth was the only noise in the otherwise silent forest. 3 days into the backcountry, and he'd finally outpaced the occasional day hikers and weekend warriors. Here, in the untouched wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, he could finally breathe. Or at least that's what he'd told himself when planning this trip. Ethan adjusted his pack, feeling the comfortable weight of survival gear against his back. The morning mist hung between ancient cedars and towering firs, dissolving the forest into a dreamscape that felt both familiar and eerily foreign. 20 years as a wilderness guide had taught him to read these woods like a book, but today something felt off. "No birds," he muttered, the words swallowed by the strange quiet. He'd noticed it about an hour back, the gradual thinning of wildlife sounds until they'd vanished altogether. No chickadees calling from the canopy, no squirrels chattering, not even the buzz of insects, just the sound of his own breathing and footfalls. Probably just a predator in the area, he reasoned. Mountain lion, maybe. But there was something else, too. Something he couldn't quite place. A heaviness to the air, like the pressure before. A storm, except the sky above the canopy remained a clear, indifferent blue. He paused to check his map, though he barely needed it. This section of wilderness wasn't on any tourist guide, just how he wanted it. After what happened with Jason, crowds made his skin crawl. The memory rose unbidden. The crack of ice, the flash of Jason's panicked face as he plunged through, Ethan's outstretched hand closing on empty air. Too slow. Always too goddamn slow. Ethan pushed the thought away and pressed on, descending, toward the sound of running water. The river appeared through the trees, a silver ribbon cutting through the forest floor. Perfect spot to refill his canteens. As he approached the bank, something caught his eye. A moss-covered boulder jutting out over the water, unusual in its nearly perfect roundness. But it wasn't the rock itself that drew his attention. It was what was carved into it. Ethan knelt, brushing away centuries of moss to reveal an intricate symbol etched deep into the stone. It resembled nothing he recognized. Not Native American, not colonial, not anything he could place from his knowledge of local history. The pattern was elaborate, concentric circles surrounded by what looked like interwoven branches, or perhaps tentacles with strange angular glyphs scattered throughout. "What the hell were you trying to say?" he murmured, tracing the grooves with his fingertips. The moment his skin touched the carving, a jolt of something, not quite pain, not quite cold, shot up his arm. Ethan jerked back, heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. An irrational primal dread washed over him, the kind he hadn't felt since he was a child afraid of the dark. "Get a grip," he told himself firmly. But his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. Probably just some teenager's idea of a creepy prank, carving weird symbols out in the middle of nowhere. Still, it was unusual enough to document. He snapped several photos, then on impulse opened his barely there signal to post it to an archaeology forum he sometimes browsed. found this carved into a boulder, middle of nowhere, Olympic Peninsula backcountry. Anyone seen anything like site coordinates attached? The post took ages to upload in the spotty reception. When it finally went through, Ethan tucked the phone away and turned back to the river to fill his canteens. That's when he noticed the second strange thing. The water near the rock was completely still, despite the current flowing steadily everywhere else, as if the river itself was avoiding the stone. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably someone on the forum already responding. He pulled it out, expecting to see a notification from the app. Instead, a text message from an unknown number filled the screen. "Leave now, before it sees you." Ethan stared at the message, the back of his neck prickling. He glanced around the silent forest, suddenly aware of how alone he truly was. "Very funny," he said aloud, his voice sounding thin in the unnatural quiet. "Who is this?" But no answer came, only the soft gurgle of the river and his own increasingly rapid breathing. He punched in a reply. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" The message failed to send. No service. Ethan frowned. How had he received a text if there was no service? He checked the signal bars. Nothing. Yet the message was there, its warning staring back at him. "Leave now, before it sees you." A rational voice in his head suggested logical explanations, someone playing a prank, or a delayed message from earlier, or a glitch in the system. But a deeper, more instinctive part of him, the part that had kept him alive in blizzards and flash floods, whispered that something was very wrong. He looked back at the symbol, partially obscured by moss again, as if the forest itself was trying to reclaim it. The unease he'd felt when touching it returned, stronger now. For a brief moment he considered taking the warning seriously, packing up and heading back toward civilization. Then his pride kicked in. 20 years in the wilderness, and he was going to let some cryptic text and a weird carving spook him? Not a chance. Besides, his curiosity was piqued now. Who made that symbol? What did it mean? And who sent that text? "Screw it," Ethan muttered, shouldering his pack again. Instead of retreating, he decided to press deeper into the uncharted territory beyond the river. Whatever mystery waited there, he'd face it head-on. As he forded the shallow water, he didn't notice how the symbol seemed to pulse once, ever so slightly, beneath its covering of moss. Nor did he see the subtle shift in the shadows behind him, as if the darkness itself had become aware of his presence. Ethan Cole hiked onward, unaware that with each step he was moving further from salvation and closer to something ancient and hungry that had just awakened from a very long sleep. Something that now knew his name. Ethan's boots sank into the soft earth as he pushed through a tangle of salmonberry bushes. The late afternoon light filtered weakly through the canopy, casting dappled shadows that seemed to shift and dance with each step. He'd been hiking for hours since crossing the river, the strange symbol and warning text still gnawing at the back of his mind. He paused, frowning at his compass. The needle spun lazily, as if confused about which direction was north. He tapped the casing sharply. What the hell? The needle continued its aimless rotation, speeding up then slowing down in an irregular pattern. Ethan shook it, then held it at different angles. No change. Reaching for his GPS unit, he powered it up, only to find the screen flickering between coordinates that made no sense, placing him alternately in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and somewhere in Russia. "Great," he muttered, tucking both devices away. A lesser hiker might have panicked, but Ethan had navigated by the sun and stars before. He glanced upward, searching for the late afternoon sun, only to realize he couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. The light seemed to filter evenly from all sides, as if the forest itself was glowing. That wasn't possible. A faint sound caught his attention, so quiet he almost missed it. A whisper, like someone exhaling a single syllable. Ethan turned slowly, scanning the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. No answer came, but the whisper repeated, this time from a different direction. Not a word exactly, more like the suggestion of speech just beyond comprehension. "Anyone there?" He kept his tone level, reaching instinctively for the hunting knife at his belt. "Forest Service, I'm a licensed guide." The whispers multiplied, coming from all around him now. A susurration like dry leaves in wind, except there was no wind, and the forest remained preternaturally still. Ethan's pulse quickened. 20 years in the backcountry had taught him most strange sounds had rational explanations. Wind through rock formations, water moving underground, wildlife he couldn't see. But this was different. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think logically. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon in the wilderness. Isolation played tricks on the mind. Or perhaps he was near some unusual geological feature that created acoustic anomalies. Forcing himself forward, Ethan focused on finding a suitable campsite before dark. The daylight, already strange and diffuse, was beginning to fade. As he moved deeper into a stand of ancient hemlocks, he spotted a clearing ahead that would serve his purposes. Level ground, natural windbreak, no widowmakers. Overhead that might fall in the night. That's when he saw it, carved into the trunk of a massive Douglas fir at the edge of the clearing. The same symbol from the river rock, its intricate pattern unmistakable, though this version seemed fresher. The cuts into the bark still oozing, sap as if recently made. Ethan approached slowly, an inexplicable dread building in his chest. The carved lines seemed to writhe subtly under his gaze, like something living just beneath the surface of the bark. Coincidence, he told himself firmly. Has to be. But his hands trembled slightly as he began setting up camp, his gaze repeatedly drawn back to the carving. The whispers had stopped, but somehow the silence felt even more oppressive, watchful, expectant. As darkness settled over the forest, Ethan worked methodically to build a fire. The routine tasks helped calm his nerves, gathering kindling, arranging the wood in a careful pyramid, preparing his tinder. He'd built thousands of fires in conditions far worse than this. The wood was dry, the air still. It would catch easily. Except it didn't. The match flared, touched the tinder, and went out. Again and again, the flame died the moment it touched the kindling, as if smothered by an invisible force. Ethan tried different tinder, different positions, even his emergency fire starter with its shower of sparks. Nothing. Each attempt extinguished immediately. "This is impossible," Ethan muttered, examining the perfectly dry wood. He'd built fires in rainstorms, in howling wind, in snow. There was no reason this fire wouldn't light, no natural reason anyway. The darkness pressed closer as Ethan finally gave up on the fire. He set up his tent with quick, efficient movements, increasingly aware of the shadows surrounding his small clearing. Without firelight, they seemed deeper than they should be, more substantial somehow. And they were moving, not shifting with ambient light. There was none. Moving independently, flowing around the edges of his camp like liquid darkness. Ethan zipped himself inside his tent, trying to dismiss what he'd seen as a trick of his tired eyes. But even within the thin shelter, he could feel it, a presence in the darkness, watching, waiting. He flicked on his headlamp, the small circle of light offering minimal comfort. Outside, the strange clicking sounds began, like bones being tapped together or teeth chattering. The noise circled his tent, sometimes nearer, sometimes farther, but always maintaining its steady rhythm. Click, 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 click. Ethan lay rigid in his sleeping bag, knife in hand, ears straining for any change in the pattern that might indicate. What? An attack? From what? Just an animal, he whispered to himself. Probably a deer, or a branch knocking against something. But he knew no deer moved like that, with such deliberate circular pacing, and there was no wind to move the branches. The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by absolute silence. Somehow that was worse. Ethan found himself holding his breath, waiting. A soft scraping sound came from nearby, the unmistakable sound of something being carved into wood. With a surge of adrenaline, Ethan unzipped his tent and swept his headlamp beam toward the noise. The light fell on the nearest tree where fresh cuts were appearing in the bark, forming the now familiar symbol line by line, as if an invisible knife was carving it before his eyes. Ethan scrambled backward, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice cracking. "This isn't funny." The carving continued, unhurried, precise. When the final line was complete, the symbol seemed to pulse once with a dull reddish glow that faded almost instantly. Ethan didn't sleep. He couldn't. He sat with his back against a tree trunk, knife in one hand, headlamp in the other, watching the darkness for any movement. His rational mind fought desperately for explanations, elaborate pranks, stress-induced hallucinations, undiagnosed medical conditions, but none could account for what he'd witnessed. The forest had gone wrong somehow, or perhaps he had. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, Ethan made his decision. He wouldn't retreat. That had never been his way, even after Jason's death. Perhaps especially after Jason's death. When faced with the inexplicable, Ethan Cole moved toward it, not away. It was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous flaw. He would press deeper into this twisted wilderness, find the source of these anomalies, and understand the meaning behind the symbol that now seemed to be following him. What Ethan couldn't admit, even to himself, was that he no longer believed he had a choice. The path back felt somehow closed to him now, as if the forest had rearranged itself during the night. The only way was forward, toward whatever waited at the heart of this mystery. As he packed his gear with mechanical precision, Ethan didn't notice the silhouette watching from between distant trees, a figure almost human in shape but elongated and fluid, like a shadow without a source. It observed him with patient hunger, then melted back into the forest, leaving no trace but the sense of absence it left behind. Ethan shouldered his pack and set out, moving deeper into the unknown wilderness that seemed increasingly eager to receive him. The midday sun should have been high overhead, but the light filtering through the canopy remained diffuse and directionless, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan had been hiking for hours, pushing through increasingly dense undergrowth, his skin crawling with the persistent sensation of being watched. His water supply was running low. According to his now useless GPS, he should have crossed another stream by now, but the landscape seemed to have rearranged itself overnight. Nothing matched his maps anymore. When the small structure appeared through the trees, Ethan initially thought it was a mirage, a product of his increasingly paranoid mind. But as he drew closer, the weathered outlines of a ranger station took shape, its cedar siding gray with age and neglect. "Thank God," he muttered, quickening his pace. The station looked long abandoned, windows filmed with grime, moss creeping up the north wall. A faded sign hung askew. "Olympic National Forest, Blackwater Ridge Station." Ethan frowned. He knew every ranger station in these mountains, but he'd never heard of Blackwater Ridge. The door creaked open at his touch. Inside, dust motes swirled in the weak light that penetrated the filthy windows. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something acrid and unpleasant, like burnt hair. "Hello?" Ethan called, voice echoing in the empty space. The station consisted of a single room with a desk, radio equipment, and wall-mounted maps. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for what looked like years. Ethan moved to the desk, brushing away cobwebs. Papers were scattered across its surface as if someone had left in a hurry. His attention caught on a topographical map pinned to the wall, yellowed with age and covered in handwritten notes. Red X marks dotted the wilderness, concentrated around the area where Ethan had found the first symbol. Scrawled across several locations were the words "Do not approach" and sealed "Do not disturb." In the margin, someone had written in a jagged, hurried hand, "They disappear where the boundaries thin. Symbol is a seal, not a sign. Never document. Never photograph." Dr. Thorne was right. It's watching through the marks. Next to this note was a crude drawing of the symbol Ethan had found, with the name Dr. Elias Thorne, Folklore Division, written beneath it, along with what looked like contact information. Ethan's mouth went dry. He fumbled for his phone, intending to photograph the map, when the sound of boots on the wooden porch stopped him cold. The door swung open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a park ranger uniform. His weathered face suggested decades in the wilderness, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. A nameplate on his chest read, "Holloway. You shouldn't be here," the ranger said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Ethan straightened. "I'm a bit turned around. My navigation equipment's malfunctioning and not just here at this station," Holloway interrupted, eyes flicking nervously to the windows. "Here in this part of the forest, you need to leave now, before nightfall." There was an urgency in his tone that raised the hairs on Ethan's neck. "I'm an experienced guide," Ethan replied, bristling slightly. "I've been coming to these mountains for 20 years. Holloway's laugh was hollow. "Then you should know better." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. This section of forest, it's wrong. Has been since I started patrolling. 30 years ago. We don't mark it on the public maps, keep the trails well away, but sometimes people still wander in." "What are you saying?" The ranger's eyes met his, deadly serious. "People go missing here, not just lost for a few days. Gone. No bodies, no gear, nothing, like they never existed." Ethan's mind flashed to the symbol, the whispering, the shadows that moved on their own. "I found a symbol carved in stone. By the river," he said carefully, watching Holloway's reaction. "And again last night on a tree." The color drained from the ranger's face. "You saw it? Christ." He gripped Ethan's arm. "Did you touch it? Photograph it?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Both." Holloway closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. "Then it's already started. You need to get out while you still can. Head due west, don't trust your compass, use the moss growth on the trees. Keep moving until you hit the main trail. Don't stop, don't make camp, not even if night falls." "What's happening here?" Ethan demanded. "What is that symbol? A boundary marker?" Holloway's gaze darted to the windows again. "The old-timers who first ranged this forest found them. Learn to stay away. They're not meant for us to understand, just to heed." He paused. "Dr. Thorne called it a seal, keeping something in. Or out. I don't know which is worse." As if on cue, the ancient radio equipment on the desk crackled to life, emitting a burst of static that made both men jump. Through the white noise, a voice emerged, distorted, inhuman, yet unmistakably, forming words. "It sees you." Holloway's hand moved to his belt, where a service pistol was holstered. "We need to move. Now." The static intensified, the voice repeating its chilling message. "It sees you. It sees you. It sees you." Ethan backed toward the door, cold sweat beading on his forehead. "What is that? Who's broadcasting?" Holloway's face had gone ashen. "That station has been dead for 15 years. The ranger reached for his own radio, unclipping it from his belt. "This is Holloway. I need immediate evacuation from Blackwater. Code Sigma. I repeat, Code Sig..." He never finished the sentence. One moment Ranger Holloway was standing there solid and real. The next he simply wasn't. No sound, no movement, no disturbance of the dust motes floating in the air, as if he had been erased from existence between one heartbeat and the next. Only his radio remained, dropping to the floor with a clatter, still transmitting the same terrible message. "It sees you." Ethan stood frozen, shock and disbelief warring in his mind. People didn't just disappear. It violated every law of physics, every rational understanding of the world. The voice from the radio changed, becoming softer, almost seductive. "Ethan Cole, it remembers you now." Hearing his name spoken by that inhuman voice broke Ethan's paralysis. He snatched up Holloway's fallen radio and bolted through the door, heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, the forest seemed darker than before, though it couldn't be past mid-afternoon. The trees looked wrong somehow. Taller, more twisted. their shadows stretching impossibly toward him. Ethan ran blindly, no longer caring about direction or destination, driven by primal terror. Only when his lungs burned and his legs threatened to buckle did he slow, gulping air in desperate gasps. The radio in his hand had gone silent, but as he looked down at it, the display flickered, showing not emergency channels or frequencies, but a sequence of numbers that looked like coordinates. Ethan's rational mind, the part still clinging to a world that made sense, argued that he should follow Holloway's advice. Head west, find the main trail, get out of these woods. But a deeper instinct told him it was already too late for escape. Whatever boundary he had crossed when he touched that first symbol, he couldn't simply cross back. The forest wouldn't let him. His only hope lay in understanding what was happening. And according to both the map and Holloway, Dr. Elias Thorne held those answers. With trembling fingers, Ethan entered the coordinates from the radio into his GPS unit. To his surprise, the device suddenly cleared, showing a location approximately 5 miles northeast. Decision made, Ethan oriented himself and began walking, the radio clutched tightly in his hand. The weight of Holloway's sudden disappearance pressed on him like a physical burden. The ranger had tried to warn him, to help him, and now he was gone, another victim of whatever malevolence lurked in these woods. The thought that the same fate might await him sent a shudder through Ethan's body. But turning back no longer felt like an option. He had disturbed something ancient and patient, and now it was aware of him, hunting him. His only chance was to find Thorne and discover how to seal the boundary once more. As Ethan pushed deeper into the increasingly alien forest, he didn't notice how the trees behind him slowly shifted position, closing the path he had taken, erasing his trail as if he had never passed that way at all. Dusk was approaching, as Ethan pushed through a dense thicket of ferns, each step heavier than the last. The woods had grown increasingly strange, trees twisted into unnatural shapes, undergrowth that seemed to grab at his ankles, and periods where all sound would cease entirely, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. According to the coordinates on the radio, Dr. Thorne's location should be just ahead. Ethan checked his GPS again, surprised that it still functioned in this warped section of wilderness. The device showed he was nearly on top of his destination, yet nothing but endless trees stretched before him. Then he saw it, a structure so perfectly camouflaged by moss and climbing vines that it almost disappeared into the landscape. Not a ranger station, but a small dilapidated cabin with a slanted roof and boarded windows. If not for the faint light leaking through cracks in the shutters, he might have walked right past it. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ethan approached cautiously, every sense heightened. The light within the cabin flickered like candlelight, casting moving shadows against the shuttered windows. He paused at the door, listening. No sound came from inside. No movement, no breathing, nothing to suggest human presence. "Hello?" he called, knuckles rapping against the weathered wood. "Dr. Thorne? Anybody home?" His voice sounded muffled, as if absorbed by the unnaturally still air. No response came from within. The door was unlocked. It swung open with a protracted creak, revealing a single room in a state of chaotic disarray. Books and papers covered every surface, stacked. On a small desk spread across the floor pinned to walls, a narrow cot stood in one corner, blankets rumpled as if recently occupied. A kerosene lamp burned low on the desk, its flame the source of the wavering light. But no Dr. Thorne. "Hello?" Ethan called again, stepping inside. The door swung, shut behind him with a decisive click. The cabin's interior smelled of dust, old paper, and something else. A faint chemical odor, like formaldehyde or preserving fluid. Ethan moved to the desk, drawn by the organization of papers that suggested purpose rather than chaos. What he found made his blood run cold. Page after page of meticulous documentation, field notes, transcriptions of interviews with locals, historical records dating back to the earliest European explorations of the region, all centered around the symbol Ethan had found. He lifted one page, its edges yellowed with age. The Klallam people avoided this region entirely, calling it the place where shadows walk. Their oral traditions speak of a time when something broke through from the other side of dreams, taking the forms of those who saw it. The tribal elders created 7 seals to contain this entity, binding it to specific locations throughout the forest. They warned that anyone who disturbed the seals would awaken what slept beneath. Another document, this one written in Dr. Thorne's increasingly frantic handwriting. The symbol isn't a ward against evil as I first thought. It's a door. Or more accurately, a lock on a door. But it works both ways. Looking upon it draws its attention. Documenting it gives it power. I've made a terrible mistake in my research. It's found a way through. It's watching me now. Ethan's hands shook as he sifted through more papers. Drawings of the symbol appeared repeatedly, along with variations he hadn't seen before. Each had annotations beside it, noting locations throughout the Olympic Peninsula where they had been found. Next to one particularly complex variation was written, "Primary seal, contains the shadowed one." The phrase sent a jolt of recognition through Ethan. He spoke the words aloud without thinking. The shadowed one. The moment the name left, his lips, everything changed. The lamp flame froze, caught mid-flicker. The ambient forest sounds that had filtered through the walls, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, cut off abruptly, leaving a vacuum of silence so complete it felt like pressure against Ethan's eardrums. Then a knock at the window. Slow. Deliberate. 3 distinct raps. Ethan's gaze darted to the boarded window. Nothing could be out there. The cabin was miles from anywhere, and night had nearly fallen. Yet the knocking came again, more insistent. The cabin creaked as if something heavy was shifting its weight along the outer walls. Ethan stood paralyzed, watching as a shadow slid between the cracks in the boarded window, not cast by anything outside, but as if the darkness itself was seeping in, viscous and alive. A soft clicking sound filled the room, the same bone against bone rhythm he'd heard outside his tent the night before. With trembling hands, Ethan reached for Holloway's radio, which had remained silent since the ranger's disappearance. To his horror, the device crackled to life of its own accord. Through waves of static, a voice emerged. Not the inhuman monotone from before, but a man's voice ragged with exhaustion and fear. "You shouldn't have looked." Ethan nearly dropped the radio. "Dr. Thorne?" he whispered. The static cleared momentarily. "Yes. Listen carefully. I don't have much time." The voice was strained as if speaking required immense effort. "The symbol you found was a seal, one of 7 created to contain something that doesn't belong in our reality. By documenting it, by spreading its image, you've weakened the boundary." "I don't understand," Ethan said, eyeing the shadow that continued to seep through the window cracks, pooling unnaturally on the floor. "What is this thing?" "It has many names across cultures. The Watchers, the Nothing That Waits, the Indigenous. Peoples called it the one who takes your shape." A burst of static interrupted before Thorne's voice returned. "It exists in the spaces between realities, formless until it finds something to mimic. It feeds on those who perceive it." The shadow on the floor was spreading, advancing toward Ethan with deliberate slowness. "How do I stop it?" Ethan demanded, backing away. "You can't. Not alone." More static. "Find Natalie Reed. She's investigating the disappearances as part of the binding ritual." "I couldn't." The transmission cut out, then returned faintly. "Remember, it can only take you if you acknowledge it as real. Doubt is your only shield." The shadow paused in its advance, as if considering these words. "Where are you?" Ethan asked. A terrible laugh came through the static. "Where am I? I'm right here, Ethan. I've always been here. Ever since I saw the symbol. Ever since it saw me." The shadow on the floor suddenly surged forward, flowing up the wall with impossible speed. It began to take shape, a silhouette approximately human in form, but with proportions subtly wrong, limbs too long and fluid. "Run," Thorne's voice urged, fading to a whisper. while you still remember who you are." The radio died with a final burst of static as the shadow detached itself from the wall, standing three-dimensional in the corner of the cabin. It had no features, no face, just a human-shaped void that bent the light around it. Pure animal terror seized Ethan. He lunged for the door, fumbling with the handle. For one horrifying moment, it refused to turn, and he felt the temperature plummet as the shadow figure glided toward him. Then the latch gave way. Ethan burst outside, nearly falling down the cabin steps in his desperation to escape. He didn't look back, didn't stop to grab his dropped pack, just ran headlong into the darkening forest. Behind him, something emerged from the cabin door, not by opening it, but by seeping through it like ink through paper. It paused, its featureless form regarding Ethan's retreating figure. Then, with a movement like smoke in wind, it melted, back into the gathering darkness. Ethan ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to buckle. Only when he could no longer see the cabin did he slow, gasping for breath, the taste of fear metallic in his mouth. His rational mind, the part that had always insisted on logical explanations, was crumbling. What he'd seen defied natural law, defied logic, yet denying it now felt not like skepticism but delusion. Thorne's words echoed in his mind. "Doubt is your only shield." And find Natalie Reed. Whoever this journalist was, she represented Ethan's only hope of understanding the horror he'd unleashed, and perhaps finding a way to contain it again. The question was, how to find her in this twisted labyrinthine forest that seemed to rearrange itself at will. And more urgently, how to survive the night with the shadowed one now hunting him. As full darkness descended, Ethan realized he had fled without his pack, without supplies. He had only what was in his pockets, his phone, now dead, his knife, a lighter, and Holloway's radio, which remained ominously silent. He was alone in a forest that no longer obeyed natural laws, pursued by something that defied rational understanding. And somewhere in this wilderness was a woman who might hold the key to his survival, if he could find her before the shadowed one found him. Steeling himself, Ethan began to walk, guided only by instinct and the fading hope that there might still be a way out of the nightmare he had stumbled into. Dawn broke reluctantly over the forest, the sun's light diffuse and watery through the canopy. Ethan had spent the night moving, stopping only when absolute exhaustion demanded it, then pressing on after mere minutes of fitful rest. Without his pack, without supplies, he felt naked in the wilderness for the first time in decades. The radio had remained silent, but twice during the night, he'd heard the clicking sounds following him, always just beyond the range of his vision. Each time he'd changed direction, choosing paths that seemed to lead deeper into the unknown rather than out of it. Somehow he sensed that trying to leave was futile. The forest wouldn't release him until he understood what he'd awakened. Among the papers he'd hastily stuffed into his pockets before fleeing Thorne's cabin was a tattered map with coordinates scribbled in the margins. Next to one set was written, "Emergency Cache, NR, Natalie Reed." The journalist Thorne had mentioned. The GPS on his phone, miraculously functioning again, told him he was close, though close seemed meaningless in a forest that rearranged itself at will. Still, he pushed on, following the digital arrow through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. He almost missed the small structure nestled among massive cedar trees. Unlike the abandoned ranger station or Thorne's cabin, this building looked maintained, a proper ranger outpost with a metal roof and sturdy walls. A single vehicle was parked outside, a mud-splattered Jeep with press credentials hanging from the rearview mirror. Ethan approached cautiously, every nerve ending raw from lack of sleep and constant fear. The windows were illuminated from within, a warm contrast to the cold, gray morning. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of how he must appear, disheveled, wild-eyed, raving about shadows and symbols. Before he could decide, the door swung open. A woman stood framed in the doorway, a shotgun held casually but competently in her hands, its barrel pointed at the ground. For now. "You lost?" she asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp, assessing. Ethan took in her appearance. Mid-30s, athletic build, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking boots, cargo pants, and a flannel shirt. Practical wilderness attire, not the stereotypical journalist outfit. But the press pass clipped to her belt confirmed his hope. "Natalie Reed?" he asked. Her posture stiffened slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Ethan Cole. Dr. Elias Thorne told me to find you." A flicker of recognition crossed her face at the mention of Thorne, but was quickly replaced by skepticism. "Thorne's been missing for over a year." "I know. Please, I need your help." Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. "Something's happening in these woods, something impossible. People are disappearing." Natalie studied him for a long moment, then stepped back, gesturing with the shotgun. "Inside, you look like you're about to collapse." The outpost's interior was spartanly furnished but organized. Maps covered one wall with red pins marking locations throughout the Olympic Peninsula. A mobile workstation was set up on a folding table, laptop, audio recording equipment, camera gear, and stacks of notebooks. "Sit," Natalie ordered, pointing to a chair while keeping a comfortable distance. "When's the last time you ate?" Ethan realized he couldn't remember. Yesterday? Maybe the day before. She rummaged in a cooler and tossed him a protein bar and a bottle of water. Eat, drink, then talk. He devoured the bar in 3 bites, his body suddenly remembering. It's hunger. The water tasted impossibly good. "So," Natalie said, setting the shotgun aside but within easy reach. "You've met Thorne? Recently?" "Not exactly." Ethan explained his journey, the symbol by the river, the warning text, the ranger station, Holloway's disappearance, and finally, Thorne's cabin and the terrifying encounter with the shadow entity. He pulled out the papers he'd taken, spreading them on the table. As he spoke, Natalie's expression shifted from skeptical to concerned, though not necessarily believing. She examined the papers with professional interest, particularly the documents, mentioning disappearances. "I've been tracking missing persons cases in this region for 18 months, she said when he finished. 17 hikers gone without a trace. No bodies, minimal evidence, no pattern except geography. She gestured to her wall of maps. All disappeared within a 20-mile radius. "Then you believe me?" Ethan asked hopefully. Natalie gave him a measured look. "I believe you've experienced something traumatic. Whether it's what you think it is, that's another question." She tapped one of Thorne's papers. "I interviewed Thorne before he vanished. Brilliant linguist, expert in indigenous symbolism but unstable, paranoid, convinced something supernatural was happening." "Because it is," Ethan insisted. "Or," she countered, "there's something very human going on. Illegal operations in the backcountry, drug manufacturing, human trafficking, people who don't want to be found and eliminate witnesses." She shrugged. "Occam's razor. Which is more likely? Shadow monsters from another dimension or dangerous people protecting their territory?" Frustration welled in Ethan. "You think I imagined watching Ranger Holloway vanish into thin air? That I hallucinated a shadow peeling itself off the wall? Sleep deprivation, dehydration, maybe something you ate or drank?" Ethan cut her off by pulling out Holloway's radio. "Listen to this." He turned the device on. Static hissed from the speaker, then resolved into the same voice he'd heard before. "It sees you, Ethan Cole. It remembers you now." Natalie's professional detachment faltered momentarily. She took the radio, examining it. Could be rigged. Wireless receiver picking up a transmission from somewhere else. In the middle of nowhere, with no power source? Ethan shook his head. "You're grasping at straws." Natalie set the radio down carefully. "Look, I'm not dismissing your experience. I'm just not jumping to supernatural conclusions without exhausting rational explanations first." She hesitated, then added, "But I am interested in what you found, particularly that symbol. It matches descriptions from other witness accounts." Hope flickered. "Then let me show you. The original one I found by the river. If you see it for yourself." "All right," she agreed, surprising him. I need to document this properly anyway. We'll go to the site, I'll record everything, and we'll see what's there. They prepared quickly. Natalie lent Ethan a spare backpack with basic supplies: water, food, first aid. She packed her own gear, including professional recording equipment and her shotgun, just in case your shadow entity turns out to be a very human threat, she explained. As they stepped outside, the forest seemed to have reverted to normal. Birds sang, sunlight dappled the ground, a gentle breeze stirred the branches. But Ethan wasn't fooled. He felt the wrongness beneath the surface, like calm waters hiding a riptide. "We should be able to drive part way," Natalie said, heading for her Jeep. "No," Ethan replied, a cold certainty in his voice. "The roads won't lead where they should, not anymore." Natalie gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue when he insisted they proceed on foot. She activated a GPS tracker on her phone, documenting their route. "For the record," she said, setting her audio recorder running, "I'm accompanying Ethan Cole to investigate claims of unusual phenomena related to disappearances in Olympic National Forest. It's 10:17 a.m. Friday, September 15th. They hiked. For hours, the forest gradually becoming less familiar to Ethan. The landmarks he remembered seemed slightly off, rearranged in subtle ways. But eventually, the sound of running water reached them, and they emerged at the riverbank where it had all started. "This is it," Ethan said, heading directly for the moss-covered boulder. The symbol was here. But as he brushed away the moss, the stone beneath was smooth and unmarked. No symbol, no carving, nothing to indicate anything had ever been there. "No, that's impossible," Ethan muttered, scraping more moss away frantically. "It was right here, I touched it, I photographed it." Natalie watched him with a mixture of pity and concern. "Could you have misremembered the location?" "No, this is the exact spot." He pulled out his phone. "Look, I'll show you the photo." But when he opened his gallery, the image was gone. All his photos from the trip had vanished, replaced by corrupt file icons. "This isn't possible," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. Natalie's expression softened slightly. "Let me record this." She set up her equipment, a professional-grade audio recorder with an external microphone and a high-resolution camera. "Subject claims to have discovered an unusual symbol at this location," she dictated. "But no visual evidence remains. Rock. Surface appears undisturbed." She snapped several photos of the unmarked boulder. As she worked, the air grew noticeably colder. The birdsong that had accompanied their hike gradually ceased, leaving an unnatural silence broken only by the river's flow. "Do you feel that?" Ethan asked, his breath fogging slightly. Natalie nodded, professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Temperature drop. Significant." She checked her thermometer. 10 degrees in under a minute. That's unusual. She turned her microphone toward the forest, recording the silence. When she played it back, her face paled. Beneath the ambient, river sounds was something else. A voice whispering directly into the microphone, too faint to make out words but unmistakably there. "That's not possible," she murmured, echoing Ethan's earlier words. "Now do you believe me?" he asked. Before she could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, the sound of branches breaking under weight. Both turned toward the ee-eyed noise. "Could be wildlife," Natalie suggested, but her hand moved to her shotgun. "It's not," Ethan replied grimly. As if in confirmation, the clicking sound began again, that terrible bone-against-bone rhythm that had haunted Ethan for days now. It came from the direction they had arrived from, effectively cutting off their return path. "We need to move," Ethan urged, grabbing Natalie's arm. "Now." To his relief, she didn't argue, quickly packing her equipment. "Which way?" she asked, professional skepticism momentarily set aside in the face of immediate threat. Ethan pointed downstream. "That way. We need to find the next seal before nightfall." They moved quickly along the riverbank, the clicking, sounds following at a distance. As they hiked, the forest around them began to change subtly. Paths that should have led certain directions twisted back on themselves. Landmarks Natalie had carefully noted on their journey disappeared or appeared in impossible places. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, checking her GPS repeatedly. "According to this, we're walking in circles, but I know we're moving in a straight line." The sun was beginning its descent, shadows lengthening across their path. Ethan felt the familiar dread building. Night was coming, and with it, the shadowed one would grow stronger. "We need to find shelter," he said. "Somewhere defensible." Natalie frowned at her GPS. There should be another ranger station 3 miles northeast, but she trailed off, staring at her screen. "What? It's gone. The marker was there a minute ago, and now it's just gone." She looked up at Ethan, genuine fear in her eyes for the first time. "What the hell is happening to this forest?" "It's changing," Ethan replied, "rewriting itself to trap us." As the last light faded from the sky, they found themselves in a clearing neither recognized. The trees surrounding it seemed to lean inward, like watchers in a circle. There was no path leading out except the way they had come. Natalie's skepticism had eroded with each impossible turn, each vanishing landmark, each whisper captured on her recorder. Now, as she stared at the twisted forest around them, her rational worldview crumbled entirely. "This isn't possible," she whispered, but the words had lost their conviction. "No," Ethan agreed, watching the darkness gather between the trees. "It's not. Not in the world we thought we knew." As if in answer, a shadow detached itself from a distant tree, taking on a vaguely human shape. Then another, and another. The clearing was surrounded. Natalie raised her shotgun. "Will this even hurt them?" "I don't think so," Ethan said, the terrible truth settling over him. "But we need to try something." As the shadows began to close in, neither Ethan nor Natalie noticed the ground beneath their feet, where a new symbol was slowly etching itself into the earth, sealing their fate in a language older than human memory. The shadows converged, on the clearing flowing like oil across the forest floor. Natalie's shotgun blast tore through one of them, the sound deafening in the unnatural silence. But the shadow simply rippled and reformed, undisturbed. "Run!" Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the only gap in the circle of encroaching darkness. They crashed through underbrush, branches whipping their faces, roots seemingly rising from the ground to trip them. Behind, the clicking sound grew louder, more frantic, like hundreds of teeth chattering in anticipation. "This isn't possible," Natalie gasped as they ran, the words now a mantra rather than an argument. "This isn't possible." "Save your breath," Ethan panted. The weight of sleepless nights and minimal food was taking its toll. Each step felt heavier than the last. They broke through a thicket into another clearing, this one bisected by a narrow deer trail. Without discussion, they followed it, grateful for any semblance of direction in the chaotic forest. The moon should have risen by now, but the sky, above the canopy, remained pitch black, without stars or celestial guidance. The only light came from Natalie's headlamp, its beam seeming to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by the unnatural darkness. "We need to stop," Natalie finally said, her voice ragged. "Just for a minute." They paused, backs against a massive cedar trunk, both gulping air. Ethan checked over his shoulder obsessively, expecting to see the shadow figures materialize from the darkness at any moment. "What time is it?" he asked. Natalie checked her watch. "That's not right." She held out her wrist. The watch face showed 3:17, but as they stared at it, the hands began to spin backwards, then forwards at impossible speed, then stopped completely. "Time doesn't work right here," Ethan said. "Nothing does." A voice called from the distance. Ethan's voice, though his lips hadn't moved. "Natalie, this way, I found a way out." Natalie's head snapped up, eyes widening. She looked from Ethan beside her to the direction of the voice. "That's not me," Ethan finished grimly. "Don't listen, don't respond." Another call, this time Natalie's own voice. "Ethan, help me, it's got me." The sound of her own scream, terrifyingly real, echoed through the trees. Ethan gripped her arm tighter as she instinctively moved toward it. "It's trying to separate us," he whispered. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, stay with me." They pressed on, following the deer trail as it wound deeper into the forest. The terrain became increasingly surreal. Trees grew sideways from cliff faces, then bent upward at impossible angles. Some appeared to be melting, bark flowing, like wax. The ground beneath their feet occasionally rippled like water. "Look," Natalie pointed suddenly, her headlamp illuminating something ahead. In a small depression stood a circle of standing stones, reminiscent of miniature monoliths. They were weathered and ancient, each carved with variations of the symbol Ethan had found. The arrangement formed a perfect circle perhaps 30 feet across, with a flat altar-like stone at its center. "This is it," Ethan breathed. "A ritual site, like in Thorne's notes." They approached cautiously. Within the stone circle, the air felt different, heavier, as if under pressure, but somehow clearer. The oppressive sense of wrongness that permeated the forest was muted here. Natalie swept her headlamp across the site, revealing disturbing details. Scattered around the perimeter were remnants of previous visitors, a weathered backpack, a rusted camera, tattered clothing, all partially reclaimed by the forest. Most unsettling were the 7 small cairns arranged outside the circle like miniature graves. 7 seals, 7 victims, Ethan murmured, remembering Thorne's notes. Natalie had regained some of her professional composure, methodically photographing the site. "These symbols match the one you described, but they're different somehow, more complex." She was right. Each standing stone bore a variation of the basic pattern Ethan had found, but with additional elements. Lines that connected in different configurations, glyphs that seemed to shift slightly when viewed peripherally. It's a language, Ethan realized. Or a formula, each one slightly different. Natalie carefully approached the central altar stone. Its flat surface was covered in what looked like dried black residue. "Blood," she said quietly, touching it with a fingertip. "Old, but definitely blood." A sound like a sudden indrawn breath swept through the trees, making both of them freeze. The forest went completely silent. Even the constant background rustle of leaves stilled, as if everything was listening. "We should go," Ethan whispered, suddenly certain they had drawn attention they couldn't afford. Too late. From beyond, the stone circle, a figure emerged from the darkness. The beam of Natalie's headlamp caught it, illuminating a face that made Ethan's blood run cold. It was him, an exact duplicate of Ethan Cole down to the torn jacket and 3-day stubble. But its movements were wrong, too fluid, as if its joints worked differently, and its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, glowing faintly red. "Natalie," the thing said in Ethan's voice, perfectly mimicking his concerned tone. "Get away from him, that's not me." Natalie stiffened, her headlamp beam swinging between the 2 identical men. "What the hell?" "Don't listen," Ethan said urgently. "It's the entity, the shadowed one. It's taken my form." The doppelganger stepped forward, expression shifting to one of desperate concern. "He's the copy, the thing we've been running from. It's been manipulating you, using my appearance." It turned to Natalie, eyes pleading. "You have to believe me. I got separated from you about an hour ago and I've been tracking you since." "That's a lie," Ethan snapped. "We've been together the whole time." "Memory manipulation," the copy countered smoothly. "It's been altering your perception of time. Remember how your watch was spinning? That was him." Natalie's shotgun shifted uncertainly between them, her face tight with confusion and fear. "Both of you, don't move." The doppelganger raised its hands placatingly. "Be careful, Natalie. Remember what Thorne's notes said. It mimics perfectly. Your senses can't be trusted." Ethan felt a chill at how well the entity had copied not just his appearance but his knowledge, his mannerisms. If their positions were reversed, would he be able to tell the difference? "There must be a way to prove which is which," Natalie said, maintaining distance from both of them. Ethan thought frantically. What did he know that the entity wouldn't? What experience couldn't it copy from his appearance alone? Then it hit him. The scar, he said suddenly. Natalie, when we met at your outpost, you saw the scar on my forearm when I rolled up my sleeve to wash. The entity wouldn't know about that unless it had been watching us the entire time. Don't listen to it, the doppelganger warned. It's trying to confuse you. Natalie's eyes narrowed. He's right. There was a scar. Show me, both of you. Ethan immediately rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a jagged 6-inch scar running from wrist to mid-forearm. Climbing accident 5 years ago, fell on a piton. The doppelganger hesitated, then slowly rolled up its sleeve as well. Its arm was unmarked, perfect. Wait, it said, voice taking on a harder edge. The scar is on the right arm, not the left. No, Natalie said firmly, shotgun now pointed, directly at the copy. It's the left. I remember clearly. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, with a fluidity that wasn't quite human, the doppelganger's features began to shift. Its smile widened impossibly, stretching literally from ear to ear. Its eyes darkened to bottomless pits. Clever, it said, voice no longer precisely Ethan's, now layered with something ancient and cold. Few have managed such a simple test. Most are too afraid, too confused to think clearly. It took a step forward, its form rippling slightly. But it doesn't matter, you're still trapped. You were never meant to leave once you saw the seal. Natalie fired the shotgun. The blast caught the doppelganger square in the chest, but instead of blood or tissue, its torso simply rippled like water, the hole closing almost immediately. Physical weapons, it said with something like amusement. Always the first resort. Ethan grabbed Natalie, pulling her backward into the stone circle. The moment they crossed the perimeter, the doppelganger stopped, hovering at the edge but not entering. It can't come in, Ethan realized. The circle is still active somehow. The thing wearing his face tilted its head, studying them. Temporary, sanctuary, but circles can be broken. Its gaze shifted to the altar stone. You need blood to renew a seal. Fresh blood. Are you prepared for that sacrifice, Ethan Cole? Natalie had recovered her composure remarkably quickly for someone face to face with the impossible. She began photographing the standing stones methodically, focusing on the symbols. If we can understand the pattern, she whispered to Ethan, we might find a way to fix whatever you broke when you found that first symbol. The doppelganger paced the perimeter, its movements becoming less and less human, sometimes flowing like smoke, sometimes jerking like a marionette with tangled strings. All the while it spoke, its voice shifting between Ethan's, Natalie's, and others Ethan didn't recognize. I have worn so many faces, it said conversationally. Holloway, Thorne, all the others who found my seals. I am wearing them still in a way. They are here, with me, parts of me. Don't listen, Ethan warned Natalie. It's trying to get in your head. She nodded, fingers tracing the symbols on one of the stones. These tell a story. Look. This sequence repeats but with variations. As they studied the stones, trying desperately to decipher their meaning, the entity continued its psychological assault. Ethan, it said, now perfectly mimicking Jason's voice. The friend Ethan had failed to save. Why didn't you reach me in time? You were too slow. You're always too slow. Ethan flinched but forced himself to focus on the symbols. I think this is a binding ritual, Natalie said, her voice low and intense. These 7 configurations, they must be the 7 seals Thorne mentioned, a spell essentially to trap this thing. But how do we activate it? Ethan asked. The doppelganger's laughter drifted around the circle. Blood is the key. Blood is always the key. It shifted, becoming more shadow than substance. But whose blood will you offer, I wonder? His, yours, both perhaps? Suddenly it changed tactics. Or perhaps you'd like to know what happened to the others, to Holloway, to Thorne. I could show you. I could take you to them. Its form began to change again, elongating, features melting away until it was simply a humanoid shadow. Then, with a movement like smoke and wind, It vanished into the darkness, beyond their light. "Where did it go?" Natalie whispered, shotgun raised. "It's toying with us," Ethan replied, scanning the darkness. "It knows we're trapped." As if in confirmation, a voice, Ethan's voice again, called from the forest. "You were never meant to leave." The words echoed, repeated by dozens of voices, in dozens of tones, surrounding them completely. "You were never meant to leave, you were never meant to leave, you were never meant to leave." And in the darkness beyond the stone circle, shadows moved. Not just one, but many, each taking on a different human form, watching, waiting. Ethan and Natalie stood back to back in the center of their temporary sanctuary, the beam of her headlamp cutting uselessly into the gathered darkness. Around them, the ancient stones stood silent witness to their plight. The symbols etched upon them their only hope of escape, if they could decipher them before the entity found a way into their circle of protection. Or worse, before it found a way into their minds. Dawn should have come hours ago. Within the stone circle, Ethan and Natalie worked feverishly, their flashlights illuminating the ancient symbols as they tried to decipher their meaning. Outside their sanctuary, the shadows had maintained their vigil, occasionally shifting forms, or whispering with stolen voices, but never breaching the invisible boundary of the circle. "I think I understand," Natalie said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. She had arranged her photos of the standing stones in a particular sequence, creating a pattern that mirrored the circle they stood within. "It's not just a binding spell, it's a lock with 7 keys. Ethan leaned closer, struggling to focus. For the past hour, he'd been fighting a strange mental fog. Thoughts slipped away mid-formation, memories blurred at the edges. "The original symbol you found was one of 7 seals," Natalie continued. "When you documented it, took that photo, you essentially broke that seal. Now we need to restore it." "How?" Ethan asked, the word feeling strangely thick on his tongue. Natalie pointed to the central altar stone. "According to these glyphs, it requires a blood offering, a sacrifice." Her finger traced a series of symbols. "A willing exchange. Blood for binding." "That's why the entity keeps talking about blood," Ethan murmured. "Yes, but..." Natalie hesitated. "There's something else. These marks here." She indicated a sequence of glyphs at the base of one stone. "They suggest the sacrifice is permanent, a trade." The implication hung in the air between them. "Someone stays behind," Ethan said quietly. Natalie nodded, her face grim in the harsh light of the flashlights. "That's why no one has ever successfully resealed it. They were all either consumed before they could complete the ritual or they weren't willing to make that sacrifice," Ethan finished. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear the increasing fog in his mind. "What's the full ritual?" Natalie referred to her notes. 7 symbols at 7 locations, forming a containment circle. The ritual must be performed at the original breach point, where you found the first symbol. Blood must be offered to the seal by the one who broke it while another speaks the binding words. She tapped a sequence of glyphs. "These characters here." "I can't read that," Ethan said, squinting at the photos. "It's phonetic. I've been able to approximate the sounds based on Thorne's notes and comparative linguistics." She showed him another page from her notebook, where she had written out a rough pronunciation guide. As Ethan tried to focus on the strange syllables, a sharp pain lanced through his head. He gasped, doubling over. "Ethan!" Natalie grabbed his shoulders. "What's wrong?" I can't." He struggled to form the words. "Something's happening to me." The pain subsided, but in its wake came a terrifying realization. He couldn't remember his mother's name. The knowledge was simply gone, as if excised from his brain. "What's happening to me?" he repeated, panic rising in his voice. From beyond the circle, the shadow wearing his face answered, "I'm taking you, piece by piece, memory by memory. Soon there will be nothing left but a shell, and then that shell will be mine." Natalie gripped Ethan's face between her hands, forcing him to focus on her. Stay with me. Don't listen to it. But the process had already begun. As they watched, helpless, Ethan's hand briefly turned translucent, ghostly, before solidifying again. Jesus, Natalie whispered. It's not just your memories, it's erasing your existence. How long? Ethan managed. I don't know. Her voice shook slightly. But we need to complete this ritual before there's nothing left. Another wave of pain washed through Ethan, and this time when it receded, he couldn't remember where he'd grown up, the city, his childhood home, his school, all gone. Focus, Ethan, Natalie urged. What's your full name? He opened his mouth to answer, but terror struck as he realized he didn't know. I can't remember my own name, he whispered. Ethan Cole, Natalie said firmly. Your name is Ethan Cole. You're a wilderness guide with 20 years of experience. You came to these woods to find solitude after losing your friend Jason in a climbing accident. Jason, Ethan repeated, the name triggering a flash of memory, ice cracking, a hand reaching, falling short. My fault, I was too slow. Hold on to that, Natalie said, her eyes intent. That guilt, that responsibility, it's yours. It defines you. Don't let it take that from you. Somehow, the painful memory anchored him, providing a focal point, around which his fragmenting consciousness could rally. We need to move, Natalie said, gathering her equipment. We need to find the original symbol and perform the ritual before it's too late. But how do we leave the circle? Ethan asked, gesturing to the shadows still patrolling its perimeter. The moment we step outside, we make a break for it, Natalie said grimly, checking her shotgun. The entity wants to toy with us. It could have waited us out, let us starve inside this circle, but it didn't. It wants to chase, to hunt. That's not reassuring. No, but it gives us a chance. She hesitated, then added, and I think it needs you at the original site to complete your absorption or whatever it's doing. That's why it keeps talking about blood and sacrifice. Before Ethan could respond, another wave of mental erasure struck him. This time, his entire right arm faded to transparency, along with memories of his first wilderness expedition. He staggered, would have fallen if Natalie hadn't caught him. We can't wait any longer, she said. Ready? Ethan nodded, though in truth he felt anything but ready. They gathered their minimal equipment and moved to the edge of the circle. The shadows immediately converged, sensing their intent. Dozens of faceless silhouettes pressed against the invisible barrier, their forms flickering between human shapes and something altogether alien. On 3, Natalie said. 1, 2, 3. They burst through the boundary, Natalie firing the shotgun in a wide arc that temporarily dispersed the closest shadows. They ran headlong into the forest, no longer caring about direction or stealth, driven by desperate necessity. Behind them, the shadows gave chase, flowing between trees with impossible speed. Voices called out, some begging, some threatening, some mimicking their own panicked breathing. Ethan stumbled, another piece of himself fading, the knowledge of how to navigate woodland terrain, a skill central to his identity. Natalie hauled him up, half dragging him forward. Keep moving, she urged. Stay with me. The forest around them began to shift again, trees bending and reforming, paths appearing and disappearing. But instead of disorienting them further, the changes seemed to be guiding them in a specific direction, toward the river, where Ethan had found the first symbol. It's helping us, Ethan gasped, as a thicket parted before them like a curtain. Or it's hurting us, Natalie countered grimly. They broke through the tree line and found themselves at the riverbank. There, gleaming in the strange, timeless light of the distorted forest, was the moss-covered boulder. But now the symbol was clearly visible, carved deep into the stone and glowing with a faint reddish light. It was gone before, Natalie said, breathing hard. When we came here earlier, it wanted us to find the ritual first, Ethan realized. To understand the price, another piece of him vanished. his knowledge of rock climbing, another core aspect of his identity. The shadows pursuing them halted at the edge of the small clearing, forming a semicircle but not approaching. At their center stood Ethan's doppelganger, now more shadow than substance, its features constantly shifting between his face and others. Holloway, Thorne, strangers Ethan didn't recognize. "You understand now," it said in its layered voice. "The price of knowledge. The cost of seeing what was hidden." Natalie positioned herself between Ethan and the entity. "We're going to seal you back where you belong." The thing laughed, the sound rippling through the clearing like wind through dead leaves. "With what? His blood?" It gestured to Ethan. "Look at him. There's barely enough left to matter." Ethan glanced down at himself and saw with horror that his body had become semi-transparent like a ghost in an old photograph. Looking at Natalie, he could see the fear in her eyes as she beheld what he had become. "Tell me the ritual," he said quietly. "Ethan, no." "Tell me." His voice cracked with the effort of holding himself together. "If I'm already fading, let it mean something." Tears welled in Natalie's eyes, but her journalist's pragmatism won out. She showed him her notes one last time. "You need to place your blood on the symbol while I speak these words. But Ethan, it's a one-way door, whoever seals it." "Stay sealed," he finished. "I know." Another wave of erasure hit him, stronger than before. This time, whole years vanished from his memory. His training as a guide, his certification, his first solo expedition. His legs began to fade, becoming mist-like from the knees down. "It's now or never," he gasped. Natalie's composure cracked. "I can't let you do this. You have to." He smiled weakly. "Besides, what choice do I have? I'm already disappearing. There must be another way." "There isn't." He reached out, his increasingly insubstantial hand touching her cheek. "You know that. You've seen the evidence." From the edge of the clearing, the entity watched their exchange with patient malevolence. It knew they had no choice, knew the inevitable outcome, and seemed to relish their struggle against it. Ethan turned to the boulder, the symbol pulsing in time with what remained of his heartbeat. Only one memory anchored him now: Jason, falling through the ice, Ethan's hand reaching too late. That moment of devastating failure that had defined the rest of his life. But now perhaps he could succeed where he had once failed. Save someone else, even at the cost of himself. "I'm ready," he said. Natalie wiped away tears, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. She positioned herself beside him at the boulder, notebook open to the binding words. "Once I start, I can't stop," she warned. "And when it's done, I know." Ethan drew his knife, the one piece of equipment he had managed to keep through everything. "Do it." As Natalie began to recite the strange, guttural syllables from her notes, Ethan drew the blade across his palm. Blood welled, surprisingly substantial for a body that was halfway to non-existence. The moment his blood touched the glowing symbol, everything changed. The reddish light flared blindingly bright. The air pressure in the clearing dropped precipitously, creating a vacuum that pulled at their clothes and hair. The shadows at the perimeter shrieked, a sound no human throat could make, and rushed forward as one. Natalie's voice rose, fighting to be heard above the cacophony. The words seemed to take physical form in the air, shimmering like heat waves. The leading edge of the shadow mass reached them just as Ethan pressed his bleeding palm flat against the center of the symbol. Pain beyond anything he had ever experienced lanced up his arm and through his entire being. He screamed but held his position even as more of his body began to fade. "Don't stop!" he shouted to Natalie, seeing her falter at his obvious agony. "Finish it," she continued, tears streaming down her face, the final words of the binding, ritual echoing with strange harmonics that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The shadows engulfed them both, cold as the void between stars. Ethan felt them pulling at him, tearing away the few memories he had left, unraveling the very essence of who he was. His last coherent thought was of Jason, not falling, but as he had been in life, laughing, alive, whole, and with that thought came a profound sense of peace. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though to whom, Jason, Natalie, or himself, he couldn't say. Natalie spoke the final word of the ritual, her voice breaking. Light exploded outward from the symbol, blinding in its intensity. The shadows screamed, in rage and pain, their forms compressing inward, drawn inexorably toward the stone. In that final moment of clarity, Ethan understood what the ritual truly was. Not a cage for the entity, but a transformation, emerging. The blood sacrifice wasn't just to power the seal, it was to become the seal. As the last of his physical form dissolved, Ethan felt himself expanding, spreading into the very fabric of the symbol itself. His consciousness, what remained of it, wrapped around the writhing darkness of the shadowed one, binding it, containing it, becoming one with the ancient pattern etched in stone. "Ethan!" Natalie's voice seemed to come from very far away. He tried to respond but found he no longer had a voice or a mouth to form words. He was the symbol now, and the symbol was him, an eternal guardian at the boundary between worlds. As the binding completed, a shockwave of power pulsed outward, knocking Natalie to the ground. When she looked up, blinking away tears and spots from the flash, the clearing had changed. The shadows were gone. The oppressive sense of wrongness had lifted. Sunlight, real sunlight, filtered through normal trees. Birds sang in the distance, and where Ethan had stood, there was nothing. Only the moss-covered boulder remained, the symbol once again hidden beneath layers of green, sealed away with the entity it contained, and with the man who had given himself to contain it. "Ethan!" Natalie called, her voice breaking the sudden, ordinary silence of the forest. No answer came but the gentle gurgle of the river and the whisper of wind through leaves. She rose slowly, unsteadily, and approached the boulder. Placing her hand on the moss, she couldn't feel anything unusual beneath. No carving, no residual warmth, no sign of what had transpired. But she knew, and she would remember. "I'll make sure they know what you did," she promised softly. "I'll make sure they all know." There was no response, but for a moment, just a moment, the sunlight seemed to brighten, illuminating a path back toward civilization. Natalie gathered her remaining equipment with shaking hands. The forest around her was just a forest now, beautiful, primal, but normal. As if the nightmare of the past days had never happened. But the bloodstain on the moss told a different story, a story she would carry with her, always. The first rays of true sunlight filtered through the trees as Natalie emerged from the forest edge. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised and exhausted, but she was alive. Before her stretched a gravel parking lot where her Jeep still waited, exactly as she had left it days ago, or was it weeks? Time had lost all meaning in the depths of those twisted woods. For a moment, she simply stood there, blinking in the normal morning light, afraid to trust her senses. The forest behind her sounded ordinary, birds calling, insects humming, wind rustling leaves. No whispers, no clicking sounds, no shadows that moved against the natural flow of light. Slowly, as if in a dream, Natalie approached her vehicle. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, half expecting it to dissolve at her touch or transform into something nightmarish. But it remained solid, mundane, real. She slumped into the driver's seat, overcome by a wave of relief, so intense it manifested as physical pain. For several minutes she simply sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, forehead resting against its solid presence, breathing in the familiar smell of her own car, coffee stains, hiking gear, the lingering scent of the pine air freshener she'd hung from the mirror last month, a lifetime ago. Eventually, Natalie started the engine. The low rumble felt impossibly normal, grounding her in reality. She pulled out her phone, surprised to find it had signal again. The date displayed made her blink in confusion. Only 4 days had passed since she'd first ventured into those woods. It felt like years. She dialed emergency services. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report a missing person. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hoarse from screaming, from fear, from the days of horror she'd endured. His name is Ethan Cole. He was with me in Olympic National Forest. He's gone. Can you describe the circumstances of his disappearance, ma'am? Natalie opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she possibly say? That an ancient entity from beyond reality had erased him from existence? That he had sacrificed himself to seal a breach between worlds? We were hiking, she said finally. We got separated. I've been looking for days, but there's no sign of him. The dispatcher took her information, assured her that search and rescue would be dispatched immediately, and asked her to remain at her location to guide the teams when they arrived. 2 hours later, the parking lot was filled with emergency vehicles. Natalie repeated her story to park rangers, sheriff's deputies, and search team coordinators. They were professional, sympathetic, and utterly skeptical. Ms. Reed, said the SAR coordinator, a weather-beaten man named Peterson, we have no record of an Ethan Cole registered as a visitor to the park. He wouldn't have registered, Natalie insisted. He was going off trail into the deep backcountry. I understand, but there's also no record of anyone by that name being licensed as a wilderness guide in Washington state. The credentials you described, they don't exist. Natalie stared at him. That's impossible. I have his photo. I interviewed him. We spent days together in those woods. She reached for her camera only to find the memory card corrupted when they tried to view it. Her audio recordings were similarly destroyed, nothing but static where Ethan's voice should have been. Over the next 3 days, the search teams found nothing. No campsite, no equipment, no sign that Ethan Cole had ever entered the forest. A check of databases revealed no wilderness guide by that name, no record of his existence in any system. Ms. Reed, Sheriff Donovan said gently on the 3rd day, we've been thorough. There's simply no evidence that this man existed. He hesitated, then added, you were alone in those woods for several days. Dehydration, stress, isolation, they can play tricks on the mind. I know what I experienced, Natalie said flatly, but as days passed, even she began to question her memories. Had she hallucinated the entire ordeal? Created an imaginary companion to cope with the stress of being lost? The rational part of her mind, the skeptical journalist who had dismissed Ethan's stories of shadows and symbols, argued that this was the only logical explanation. Yet something deeper knew the truth. Ethan had been real. What they had experienced together had been real, and his sacrifice had saved her life, perhaps many lives. A week after emerging from the forest, Natalie returned to her apartment in Seattle. Her editor had encouraged her to take a leave of absence, concerned about her mental state. She hadn't argued. How could she write the story of what had happened when no one would believe it? When the evidence had been systematically erased along with the man who had sacrificed everything. That evening, she sat at her desk, surrounded by her notes, the only concrete evidence that remained. Her sketches of the symbols, her transcriptions of the ritual words, her timeline of events. On her computer screen, she had pulled up every missing persons case reported in Olympic National Forest for the past 50 years. The list was longer than anyone realized, and the cases shared disturbing similarities. Hikers and campers who vanished without a trace, often in the same general region where she and Ethan had encountered the entity. As she worked, Natalie absently scratched at her forearm, which had been itching persistently since her return. Pushing up her sleeve to examine the irritated skin, she froze. There, etched into her flesh as if branded, was a symbol. Similar to the one Ethan had found, but subtly different. The lines were raised, red, and inflamed, forming an intricate pattern she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a scar from her ordeal. This was new, as if it had formed beneath her skin while she slept. Panic seized her. She ran to the bathroom, scrubbing at the mark with soap, then alcohol, then a pumice stone until her skin was raw and bleeding. But the symbol remained. Unaffected by her desperate efforts, Back at her desk, trembling, Natalie compared the mark to her sketches. It was one of the 7 configurations from the Standing Stones, not the one Ethan had found, but another. Different, but connected. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Her old radio, the one she had used for work before upgrading her equipment, sat on a shelf nearby. It had been off for months, its batteries likely dead. But as Natalie stared at the symbol on her arm, the radio crackled to life of its own accord. Through waves of static, a voice emerged, not Ethan's, but familiar nonetheless. The layered, ancient voice of the Shadowed One. "You were never meant to leave." Natalie knocked the radio to the floor, backing away as if it were a venomous snake. The voice continued, undeterred. "He sealed one door, but there are always 7, always 7. Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. The entity hadn't been destroyed or even fully contained. Ethan's sacrifice had sealed one boundary, one door, but 6 remained. And somehow, she had been marked by another. The symbol on her arm pulsed once, a flare of pain shooting up to her shoulder. In that moment of searing agony, Natalie saw flashes of the forest, not as it had been, but as it would be. People drawn to the remaining symbols, discovering them one by one. The boundaries weakening, the entity feeding, growing stronger, and herself unwittingly serving as its beacon, its herald. When the vision faded, Natalie found herself on her knees, gasping for breath. The radio had fallen silent, but the damage was done. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned. The mark couldn't be removed. With shaking hands, she gathered her notes and laptop. She had work to do, research to compile, warnings to prepare, maps to mark with the locations of the remaining seals. If she couldn't escape this nightmare, she could at least try to prevent others from falling victim to it. As dawn broke over Seattle, Natalie was still working, driven by a terrible certainty that she was now part of something ancient and patient. Something that would eventually find new victims, new boundaries to break, unless she found a way to stop it first. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her desperate research. A text message from an unknown number illuminated the screen. "Leave, now, before it sees you." Natalie stared at the message, the same warning Ethan had received at the beginning of his ordeal. As she watched, the text began to change, the letters rearranging themselves before her eyes. "Too late. It already sees through you." Outside her window, a shadow moved against the morning light, not cast by anything visible, but existing, independently, watching, waiting. Natalie closed her eyes, one hand covering the symbol on her arm, and whispered the only name that still gave her hope. Ethan. Somewhere in the deep wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, beneath layers of moss on an unremarkable boulder, a symbol pulsed once with a faint reddish glow, as if in answer. But whether it was a promise of protection or a reminder of futility, Natalie couldn't know. All she knew with certainty was that some boundaries, once crossed, can never truly be sealed again. And some marks, once made, remain forever. The end up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.